Hi, I'm Kendra with Where's the Moon Astrology, and today I'm talking about Mercury and Gemini. Gemini is the mutable air sign, and Mercury is actually at home in Gemini because Mercury rules the sign of Gemini. Now, a little bit about what Mercury represents in the birth chart. Mercury is going to be your thought process, your communication, the way that you process information and then communicate it out to others. It's also going to speak to the way you learn. Mercury rules the nervous system, so anything involving the nervous system, the brain, and your thought processes, essentially. Mercury rules Gemini and is therefore at home in the sign of Gemini. This is because Gemini is a sign that has to do with communication. It's a very cerebral, intellectual sign, much about kind of taking information from the environment and assimilating it, making connections between different information. Gemini is a very intellectual sign, and Mercury is the planet of thought processes and intellectualism. So Mercury is naturally going to be at home in the sign of Gemini. So while you might think that this would be an ideal Mercury placement, that's not necessarily the case. It's going to have its pitfalls just like every other Mercury sign, but I do think that this is a pretty nice placement for Mercury because Gemini is so quick-witted, Gemini is so intellectual. Mercury is just really naturally at home here. Mercury in Gemini is going to be a person who easily connects ideas mentally. They'd probably be very, very talkative, very sociable. The real bottom line, though, is that they would be very mentally active. They would need a lot of mental stimulation. They would be people who take in a lot of information from their environment and easily connect these ideas. I feel that Mercury in Gemini really processes information by speaking about it. Gemini is very verbal. So this is going to be someone who is not only connected to these ideas and someone who's not only fairly intellectual, but it's going to be someone who verbalizes what they're learning a lot. If you meet a Mercury and Gemini person, you probably would hear about whatever it is they're interested in at the moment fairly quickly because they would want to communicate about it. They would kind of use you as a sounding board in order to learn more about the world. They might ask your opinion on things. They might just tell you what they've been interested in and what they've learned and kind of want to get your feedback. Being that Gemini is also an air sign and very sociable, this would be really important to the Mercury and Gemini person, being able to kind of discuss these ideas and being able to engage socially. I think that would be really important for Mercury and Gemini for the learning process in particular. And they would be someone who probably, Gemini is a dual-natured sign. So in any Gemini placement, you are going to find a certain duality. Now, this is often misconstrued as being two-faced. That is very common with Gemini placements. But what you're going to find with Mercury and Gemini is that they can really kind of talk out of two sides of their mouth. That's what you would perceive? Because I've noticed with Gemini placements, there's often a tendency to communicate two different ideas even within the same sentence. Now, this isn't because Mercury in Gemini is actually two-faced or actually deceitful or whatever the case may be, however they're being perceived at that moment, but it is that Mercury in Gemini is very open-minded. It is mutable air, so that means changeable air, changeable ideas. That means that they are open-minded. They are willing to take in information and change their perspective. So they might be talking out loud. So for instance, they might be talking out loud, communicating one viewpoint. And as they are talking about it, more ideas come into their mind about the situation and the different possibilities regarding the situation. And then they start in the same sentence talking about, oh, well, maybe it's actually this. But it's so flowing and seamless that it sounds like they are just being two-faced. No, what they're trying to do is process information. They're trying to get the full picture of the situation, and that involves looking at all sides of it. So that's just how Mercury and Gemini is communicating. That's how they learn. They can be very, very quick-witted and sharp-tongued, so they would be able to assimilate the information and connect the dots very quickly in order to kind of form a cohesive picture of the situation. They can be very, very curious people as well. So this being an air sign, they would really want to inquire about the world around them. Their friends, they want to know what's going on with their friends. They're asking about, a situation with their friends. They're waiting for something to make them laugh. They're looking for a funny story. They're really engaged with you. You actually feel when you're talking to someone with Mercury and Gemini that they care what you have to say, because they are genuinely interested on an intellectual level. They might not care so much on an emotional level, but they do care on an intellectual level what you have to say. One thing that is frustrating about Mercury and Gemini that I have noticed is that they have a tendency to ask for advice because they are processing information verbally and they are processing information in an outward way, being that Gemini is a yang sign and a sociable yang sign. What tends to happen is that Mercury and Gemini will ask you for advice on a situation. You'll give them that advice and they'll say, "No, that's dumb. I don't like that idea. I'm going to do this instead." Well, that's because what they really needed was to hear a perspective so that they could process that perspective and see what it is that they really wanted. It's kind of like when you're a kid and you already know kind of unconsciously what you want, and then you play heads or tails, and then say you chose tails and it lands on heads, and then you realize that you really wanted tails, so you go with tails. That's kind of Mercury and Gemini. They need to hear an opposing perspective in order to understand that they didn't really want that perspective. They already knew what they wanted anyway, but they needed to communicate with someone in order to get that feedback and realize what they actually wanted. And it's very frustrating for the person who is giving them advice, thinking that Mercury and Gemini really wanted that advice. But I think that that's pretty common with all Gemini placements, but especially Mercury and Gemini, because they are very verbal. They need to connect verbally, and that helps them learn. As far as how Mercury and Gemini will learn best, again, I think that that is going to have a very social component to it. So it's going to have a lot to do with communication. It's going to have a lot to do with making connections with other people. It's going to involve that feedback. They would probably work very well in a group setting, group dynamic, to where they can communicate their ideas, they can communicate information, and get a lot of feedback. And the more different perspectives that they're getting, the more different ways of learning that Mercury and Gemini is exposed to, the better that's going to be for Mercury and Gemini, because it's really all about that experience. It's really all about taking in a lot of information and assimilating it to form a more cohesive picture. Gemini also loves to debate. They really like to debate. So hearing opposing viewpoints and having an opportunity to debate that will actually help Mercury and Gemini learn, because they are able to then strengthen their own perspective. And they're able to also hear an opposing perspective and take in that information so that they are better able to counter those points the next time they encounter that debate. They really like to take in all those opposing viewpoints so that they can really get a larger perspective on what it is that they're dealing with, and if they can really accept the viewpoint that they have taken. Because once again, Mercury and Gemini is very intellectual and very open-minded. So if you make a good counter argument, Mercury and Gemini will either adopt some of your viewpoints, or they'll work hard to counter your viewpoints. And it's entirely impersonal. That's something you have to remember about Mercury and Gemini, or really any Gemini placement, because Gemini loves to debate. And it has nothing to do with liking you or not liking you. It has nothing to do with you at all. They like that debate. They like that social engagement, and that helps them learn. Now, Mercury and Gemini, similar to Mercury and Aries, is going to have a hard time processing a lot of heavy information. They're going to have a hard time having the patience to go get all the way through a large block of text or something like that. It's really best for Mercury and Gemini to process bits of information at a time and assimilate these small bits of information, the small details. So again, bullet points, that's something I recommended for Mercury and Aries as well. Being able to organize that information in a way that makes sense and isn't too intimidating, a block of text, like a wall of text, that can be very intimidating to Mercury and Gemini. So they would really rather process small bits of information and learn in ways that keep them entertained. Mercury and Gemini is also easily bored. Any Gemini placement is easily bored. So having something that's a little more stimulating, a little more engaging, that's why they like the social aspect of learning. That's going to be really good for Mercury and Gemini. And as far as learning from, text or whatever, it's going to be really important for them to have small bits of information to process instead of a big wall of text. That's going to be pretty intimidating to them. So if you're a Mercury and Gemini, maybe a positive thing for you, if you don't have those, little notes, would be to kind of go over the highlights and make yourself like note cards, study cards, something, that has small bits of information. You can assimilate this information in a way that makes sense to you, even if the text looks formidable and you really don't want to go there. If you're learning more casually, you can learn from YouTube videos, shorter YouTube videos or something like that that would help you process that information in a more fun and stimulating way. That would also be very good for Mercury and Gemini. Anyway, that's all I have to say about Mercury and Gemini, and I did want to remind you that I have all kinds of readings in my store. I'm leaving the link in the description below this video. I have birth chart readings, mini birth chart readings, Mercury report readings, and a variety of other reading types. So I really hope you check that out. Once again, I hope you enjoyed this video and have a great day.